This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.
The great hall of the Eternal Throne was silent in a way that only absolute power could create. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear. Thick, suffocating, deliberate. Emperor Valerian Thorne sat at the head of a table carved from obsidian, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gray eyes scanning reports from provinces he had never visited and would never need to. Around him, advisors spoke in measured tones, each word weighed for survival. They reported harvests, rebellions, executions. He listened without expression, nodding once to approve a death sentence, twice to delay a trade agreement. The empire turned on his word. It had for 23 years. And in all that time, he had never once looked up when the door behind him opened and a young woman entered carrying a silver tray of water and wine. She moved like a shadow, quick, quiet, practiced. She had done this every morning since she was 16. 6 years. 2,000 mornings. And he had never asked her name. Maelis Rowan had long accepted that invisibility was her inheritance. She had no family name that mattered, no patron in the capital, no beauty that stopped conversations. She was simply there, a piece of palace infrastructure, as permanent and unremarkable as the stone columns. She placed the goblet at the emperor's right hand with the same precision she always had, her fingers steady even as her heart understood what the rest of her refused to admit. She had become dangerously comfortable in his presence. Not because he spoke to her, he never did, but because she had learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion in the way he rubbed his temple when the council argued, the brief, nearly imperceptible softening in his expression when the room finally emptied and he thought no one remained. She saw him. She always had. And that was the most reckless thing a servant could do. This morning, though, something was different. As Maelis turned to leave, Valerian's hand moved, not to the goblet, but to the Kong air beside it, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. His fingers hovered for half a breath before he pulled them back, his jaw tightening in a way she had never seen. She paused at the door. He said nothing. She left. And neither of them knew that in 7 days she would be gone from the palace forever, and that the emperor would spend the next year searching his empire for a ghost he had never bothered to see while she still stood in front of him. If you've ever felt invisible to someone who should have seen you, if you've ever been the last person noticed in a room you never left, then you already know where this story is going. But stay with me. Because what happens when the most powerful man in the world finally opens his eyes might be the most devastating part of all. Subscribe if you want to see how far a mistake can travel, like if you believe some things can't be undone. And comment below, have you ever been someone's greatest regret? I read every single one. Maelis Rowan had been born in the servants' quarter of the imperial city on a winter morning so cold that her mother wrapped her in kitchen linens because there were no blankets to spare. Her father had been a stable hand who died when she was 3, trampled during a military parade he had been ordered to manage alone. Her mother followed him 6 years later, worn to nothing by laundry work and lung fever. Maelis inherited no land, no coin, no letters of recommendation. What she inherited was a position. The palace needed bodies. She was 9 years old, literate enough to follow instructions, and small enough to move through hallways without being noticed. She was hired the same day her mother was buried. The first decade of her service was mechanical. She learned to scrub floors until the marble reflected torchlight, to fold imperial linens into perfect squares, to carry trays without rattling glass, to speak only when directly questioned. She learned which guards would let her pass without inspection, and which would make her wait in the cold for the pleasure of watching her shiver. She learned that power had a smell: leather, ink, wine, and something else. Something sharp and old like iron left too long in the rain. She learned that the palace was not a home. It was a machine. And she was a replaceable part, oiled into silence, updated when broken. By the time she turned 16, Maelis had been assigned to the emperor's personal wing. It was not an honor. It was a logistical decision. The previous attendant had been dismissed for trembling during a council session. Her hands had shaken so badly she spilled wine across a military map. Valerian Thorne did not tolerate incompetence. He did not tolerate nervousness. He tolerated function. Maelis was told she would serve his chambers, prepare his morning refreshment, and maintain the silence expected of someone who did not exist beyond her utility. She was warned that he did not like to be looked at directly. She was told never to ask questions. She was told that if she lasted a year without incident, she might be reassigned somewhere safer, quieter, less suffocating. She lasted 6 years, not because she was ambitious, not because she wanted proximity to power, but because she discovered something unexpected in those early mornings when she entered the Great Hall and the Emperor sat alone, staring at maps of a world he ruled but would never touch. He was tired, bone-tired in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. She saw it in the way his hand paused over documents before signing death warrants. She saw it in the way he closed his eyes for 3 full breaths before the advisors arrived, as if gathering the energy to wear his face again. And she understood, in a way that made her chest ache, that he was lonelier than anyone she had ever known. She never said this aloud. But she started moving more carefully in his presence, not out of fear, but out of something gentler. It became a rhythm. Every morning before dawn, Maelis would enter the hall, place the tray, pour the water, set the wine. She would adjust the lamp if the flame was too low. She would open the eastern window slightly if the room smelled of old parchment and sleeplessness. Small things. Things no one had asked her to do. And Valerian, though he never turned, never acknowledged her, stopped flinching when the door opened. His shoulders, which tensed at every other sound, remained still when her footsteps crossed the stone. He never thanked her. He never spoke. But his hand always moved to the goblet exactly 3 seconds after she placed it. Like clockwork. Like trust. Valerian Thorne had not always been this way. There were people in the Empire old enough to remember when he smiled. Briefly, sparingly, but genuinely. That was before the rebellion of the Southern Reach, before his younger brother led half the military into open treason, before Valerian was forced to choose between family and survival. He chose survival. He always did. His brother was executed in the central square on a morning that smelled of rain and blood. Valerian watched from the palace balcony, his face carved from marble, his hands locked behind his back. He was 26. He never smiled again. The Empire learned that mercy was not a currency he traded in. Loyalty was rewarded with land. Betrayal was answered with erasure. Over the years, Valerian fortified himself the way other men fortified cities. He built walls where there had once been doors. He replaced affection with utility, companionship with competence, trust with surveillance. His court was populated by people who feared him, needed him, or both. No one touched him unless summoned. No one questioned him unless invited. He had mistresses, briefly, women selected for discretion and political advantage, women who understood that intimacy ended at the bedroom door. They were compensated generously and dismissed quietly. None of them lasted longer than a season. None of them left anything behind. He told himself this was strength. He told himself that a man who ruled an empire could not afford softness. He believed it so completely that he stopped noticing when softness appeared anyway. It happened so gradually that even Maelis didn't realize she had become something other than invisible. It started with the small adjustments, opening the window, adjusting the light. Then it became the way she learned to read his moods without him speaking. If the reports on his desk were stacked unevenly, she knew the council had argued. If the wine from the night before remained untouched, she knew he hadn't slept. If his jaw was tight and his breathing shallow, she knew someone had threatened the Empire's stability and he was calculating the cost of retaliation. She never asked. She never commented. But she started responding in ways no one had instructed her to. She brewed tea instead of pouring wine on mornings when exhaustion etched lines into his face. She left the curtains closed on days when the sunlight would have been unbearable. Valerian noticed none of this consciously, but his body did. On mornings when Maelis was delayed, reassigned briefly to other duties, or held up by palace bureaucracy, he found himself irritated by the replacement servant's footsteps. Too loud, too uncertain. The room felt wrong when someone else poured the water. The temperature was off. The timing was wrong. He would wave them away impatiently, work through the morning in sour silence, and feel an inexplicable relief when Maelis returned the next day and everything settled back into its proper order. He never thought to ask why. He never thought to question why one servant's presence felt like equilibrium and another's felt like intrusion. She was just there, the way air was there, essential and unnoticed. But there were moments, small, fleeting, dangerous, when the wall cracked. Once, during a particularly brutal winter, Maelis entered the hall and found Valerian standing at the window, his back to the room, his shoulders locked in a posture she recognized as pain. She set down the tray and hesitated. Protocol demanded she leave. Instinct told her to stay. She compromised. She moved to the fireplace, which had burned low, and added wood without asking permission. The sound of the flames rising filled the silence. Valerian turned his head slightly, not enough to see her, but enough to acknowledge the warmth. His voice, when it came, was so low she almost missed it. "You don't have to do that." It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't dismissal. It was something in between. Maelis paused, her hand still on the iron poker. "I know," she said quietly. And then she left. Neither of them mentioned it again. But the next morning, the fire was already lit when she arrived. The Imperial Council convened every third day, and those were the mornings Maelis dreaded most. Not because of the work, her duties remained the same, but because of what she witnessed. The council was composed of 12 men, each representing a different faction of the empire: military generals, trade lords, religious authorities, land barons. They entered the Great Hall like wolves circling a larger predator, all teeth and performance. They spoke in careful circles, proposing strategies that benefited their own territories while cloaking ambition in patriotic language. And Valerian sat at the head of the table, listening with the patience of someone who had heard every lie, every manipulation, every thinly veiled threat 1,000 times before. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. When he spoke, the room went silent. When he decided, the matter was settled. But Maelis saw what the council did not. She saw the way Valerian's hand tightened around the armrest when they spoke over each other, the way his jaw shifted when someone suggested a policy that would devastate the lower provinces, the way his eyes went flat and distant when they congratulated him on decisions he despised, but had no choice but to make. She saw the toll. She saw the way he aged faster in those 3-hour sessions than in entire weeks of solitary work. And she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that the Empire was devouring him from the inside. He was not a tyrant drunk on power. He was a man trapped inside a role that required him to be inhuman, and no one around him cared enough to notice. One morning, after a particularly venomous session where 2 council members had nearly come to blows over grain distribution, Maelis entered to clear the chamber and found Valerian still seated, staring at nothing. The room was empty. The advisors had fled the moment he dismissed them. The silence was oppressive. She moved quietly, gathering empty goblets, stacking abandoned documents. She could feel his exhaustion like a weight in the air. As she reached for the wine decanter near his hand, he spoke without looking at her. "Do you think they believe their own lies?" His voice was hoarse, stripped of the commanding edge it carried in front of others. Maelis froze. He had never asked her a question before, never addressed her as if she were capable of thought. She could have deflected. She could have murmured something non-committal and left. But something in the rawness of his tone made her answer honestly. "I think they believe what they need to believe to survive you, Your Majesty." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. She tensed, waiting for anger, for dismissal, for the cold rebuke she had just earned. But Valerian only exhaled, a sound caught between a laugh and a sigh. "An honest answer," he said quietly. "I'd forgotten what those sound like." He turned his head slightly, not enough to meet her eyes, but enough that she knew he was aware of her as more than a shadow. "What's your name?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Maelis felt her heartbeat in her throat. "Maelis, Your Majesty." He repeated it once, slowly, as if testing the weight of it. Then he turned back to his papers. "You may go, Maelis." She left the room on unsteady legs, her hands trembling as she carried the tray down the corridor. He had asked her name. after 6 years, after 2,000 mornings. He had asked. And the way he said it, careful, deliberate, like he was committing it to memory, made something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope. The kind of hope that had no place in the life of a servant, the kind that could destroy her if she let it grow. She told herself it meant nothing. He was tired. He was lonely. By tomorrow, he would have forgotten. But when she returned the next morning, Valerian looked up as she entered. Just for a second. Just long enough for their eyes to meet. And when she set down the tray, he said, "Thank you, Maelis." 2 words. Quiet. Unremarkable to anyone else. But to her, they felt like the earth shifting beneath her feet. Everything changed and nothing changed. Valerian still ruled with absolute authority. The council still schemed. The empire still turned on the axis of his will. But in the small hidden spaces between public performance and private exhaustion, something unfamiliar began to take root. He started noticing her. Not in the way men noticed women. There was nothing predatory in his gaze, nothing that made her feel unsafe. He noticed her the way someone notices the first star at dusk or the smell of rain before a storm. Small, inevitable, quietly essential. He began timing his arrival to the Great Hall so that he entered just as she finished preparing the room. He told himself it was coincidence. But coincidences didn't happen every single morning for 3 weeks straight. Maelis felt the shift and it terrified her. She had survived 6 years by being invisible. Now she was seen, and she didn't know the rules anymore. She caught herself adjusting her hair before entering his chambers, smoothing her dress, making sure her hands didn't shake when she poured his water. She hated herself for it. This was dangerous. Servants who became visible to emperors did not have happy endings. They became warnings. Cautionary tales whispered in the kitchens about girls who forgot their place and paid for it with their lives, or worse. Their reputations destroyed, their families punished, their names turned into insults. She told herself to pull back, to return to the safety of anonymity. But every time she decided to stop meeting his eyes, he would say something, some small observation, some question that required her thoughts, not just her obedience. And she would forget how to protect herself. One evening, long past the hour when she should have left the palace, Maelis was summoned to Valerian's private study. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the spiral staircase to the emperor's personal tower. She had never been called there before. No servant had, not in living memory. The guards at the door studied her with suspicion but stepped aside when she gave her name. Inside, the room was smaller than she expected, lined with books whose spines were cracked from use, maps pinned to walls, a single desk buried under correspondence. Valerian stood by the window, his back to her, outlined by moonlight. He didn't turn when she entered. "I need your opinion on something," he said, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. It was the uncertainty that frightened her most. Emperors were not uncertain. He gestured to the desk where a letter lay open, its wax seal broken. "A petition," he explained, "from a village in the northern province. They're requesting a delay on tax collection due to failed harvests. The council recommended I deny it. They say granting leniency sets a dangerous precedent, that every starving village will demand the same." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the parchment. "I signed the denial this morning, but I keep thinking about the way it was written. The village elder who wrote it used to be a soldier. I remember his name from old military records. He fought in the Eastern Campaign, lost his leg defending supply lines that kept my armies fed." Valerian turned to face her then, and Maelis saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Doubt. "Tell me honestly, Maelis, if you were that man, if you had sacrificed everything for an empire that now refuses to help you survive, what would you think of your emperor?" The room felt too small, the question too large. Maelis knew the safe answer. She knew she should praise his wisdom, defer to the council's expertise, remind him that empires could not run on sentiment. But he wasn't asking for safety. He was asking for truth. And she found herself incapable of lying to him. "I would think," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that my emperor had forgotten what it feels like to be powerless. I would think that the man I fought for still existed somewhere beneath the crown. And I would hope, even knowing it was foolish, that he might remember me before I starved." the silence that followed felt eternal. Valerian stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he moved to the desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment, and began writing. When he finished, he sealed it and handed it to her. "Deliver this to the courier station. It grants the village a 1-year tax suspension and provides emergency grain from the imperial reserves." His voice was steady, but his eyes held something fragile. "Thank you, Maelis." The letter changed something fundamental between them, though neither spoke of it directly. Valerian began seeking her presence in ways that went beyond protocol. He would ask her to remain in the study while he worked, ostensibly to refill his wine or adjust the lamps, but she understood the real reason. He needed a witness who wasn't performing for him. Someone who saw him make difficult choices and didn't judge him for the weight they carried. The council members watched him decide matters of life and death with hungry eyes, calculating how each verdict affected their own power. Maelis simply watched him be human, and somehow, impossibly, that made the decisions easier to bear. He started explaining his reasoning aloud, not asking for approval, just processing through speech. She listened. She always listened. The palace staff noticed. Whispers began circulating through the servants' quarters like smoke through cracks. The emperor's new favorite. The girl who enters his study after dark. The one he speaks to like an equal. Maelis felt the shift in how others treated her, some with resentment, others with fear, a few with pity. The head housekeeper, an iron-spined woman named Thessa, who had served the palace for 40 years, pulled Maelis aside one morning and gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise. "Whatever you think is happening," Thessa hissed, her breath sharp with concern. "It isn't. Men like him don't love, girl. They consume, and when they're finished, they discard. I've seen it before. Bright young things who thought proximity to power meant protection. It doesn't. It means you're first in line when he needs someone to blame." Maelis wanted to argue. She wanted to insist that Valerian wasn't like that what existed between them was different, built on respect and quiet understanding rather than lust or manipulation. But the words died in her throat because she knew Thessa was right about one fundamental truth. She had no protection, no contract, no title. Nothing that would stop Valerian from erasing her existence if she became inconvenient. She was still a servant. He was still the emperor. And history was full of women who forgot that distinction and paid for it with everything they had. That night, Maelis lay awake in her narrow bed in the servants' wing, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself to stop, to pull back, to remember her place before it was too late. But the next morning, when she entered the great hall and found Valerian already there, his shoulders tense with some new crisis, something in her simply softened. He looked up when she entered. Actually looked up, met her eyes, and for half a second his expression shifted from the iron mask of imperial authority to something achingly grateful. As if her presence alone steadied him, as if she mattered. And Maelis understood with devastating clarity that she was already lost. Not because he had seduced her or manipulated her, but because somewhere in the accumulated weight of 2,000 mornings, she had stopped seeing the emperor and started seeing the man. The lonely, exhausted, impossibly isolated man who carried the weight of an empire on shoulders that were still somehow just human. She set down the tray with steady hands and met his gaze without flinching. "There's been another assassination attempt," Valerian said quietly, his voice stripped of ceremony. "Not a report. A confession. Third one this year. They caught the conspirators before they reached the palace. My head of security wants them publicly executed as a deterrent." He paused, his fingers drumming once against the table, a rare tell of agitation. "But 2 of them are barely older than you. Farm boys radicalized by a preacher who convinced them I'm a tyrant sent by dark gods to punish the faithful." He looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression. Something that asked a question he couldn't voice. Maelis took a slow breath. "What would happen," she asked carefully, "if instead of executing them, you sent them home with a message?" Valerian's eyebrow lifted. "What message?" She held his gaze. "That their emperor is not afraid of misguided boys. That mercy is not weakness. That power secure enough doesn't need to prove itself through blood." The silence stretched. Then Valerian smiled. Barely, just a ghost of it. But real. "You're dangerous, Maelis Rowan," he said softly. "Far more dangerous than any assassin." The young conspirators were sent home with pardons and a year's worth of grain for their families. The council was furious. General Marcellus, the most vocal of the military advisors, argued for 2 hours that clemency would be interpreted as weakness, that every rebel faction across the empire would see this as invitation to strike. Valerian listened with his characteristic stillness, then delivered his verdict in a voice that permitted no argument. "The empire is strong enough to withstand mercy. If it isn't, then we've already lost and simply haven't admitted it yet." The matter was closed. But Marcellus left the chamber with eyes that lingered too long on the emperor, calculating, reassessing. Maelis, standing in the shadows near the doorway, felt ice slide down her spine. She had seen that look before, on men who were about to do something unforgivable. She said nothing. It wasn't her place to voice suspicions about a decorated general based on intuition alone. But she began paying closer attention during council sessions, watching the way Marcellus positioned himself, always closest to the door, always with clear sightlines to Valerian, always accompanied by the same 3 captains who wore their loyalty like armor. She noticed how he deflected questions about troop movements in the eastern territories, how he changed the subject whenever border security was mentioned, how his fingers tapped a specific rhythm against his sword hilt when he was calculating something he didn't want observed. Maelis was not trained in politics or military strategy, but she had spent 6 years learning to read the single most guarded man in the empire. She knew what hidden intent looked like, and Marcellus was hiding something massive. Valerian, for all his strategic brilliance, was blind to it, not because he was foolish, but because he had known Marcellus for 20 years. The general had served under Valerian's father, had stood beside him during the rebellion, had executed his own cousin when the man was discovered plotting treason. Valerian trusted him the way you trust bone-deep foundations. Unthinkingly. Absolutely. And that trust, Maelis realized with growing dread, was the vulnerability Marcellus was counting on. She debated for 3 days whether to speak. Every instinct screamed that voicing suspicion against a high-ranking general would end her. Marcellus had power, connections, the loyalty of half the military. If she was wrong, she would be dismissed as a paranoid servant overstepping her station. If she was right but couldn't prove it, she would simply disappear. No trial. No questions. Just gone. But on the 4th morning, as she watched Valerian sign orders that would send additional troops to the eastern border, troops that Marcellus himself had requested, she couldn't stay silent anymore. That evening, when Valerian summoned her to his study, as had become their unspoken routine, Maelis stood before him and spoke the most dangerous words she had ever said. "Your Majesty, I believe General Marcellus is preparing to betray you." The room went absolutely still. Valerian's hand, which had been reaching for his wine, stopped midair. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A sharpening, a cold assessment that reminded her exactly who she was speaking to. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, lethally soft. "That is a grave accusation, Maelis. One that could see you imprisoned for slander if you're wrong, or executed if you're right and he discovers you voiced it." Maelis forced herself to breathe evenly, to meet his gaze without flinching. "I know. But I've watched him for weeks now. The way he positions himself during council. The way he deflects questions about Eastern deployments. The way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "He looks at you the way a man looks at an obstacle, not an emperor, not a leader, an obstacle to be removed." Valerian was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he rose from his chair and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture she recognized as deep thought. "Marcellus has been with me since the beginning," he said quietly. "He helped me survive the rebellion. He's the reason I'm still alive." Maelis understood what he wasn't saying. That believing her meant accepting another betrayal. That trusting her, a servant he'd known for months in any meaningful way, over a general he'd trusted for decades, was irrational. Impossible. And yet, "I'm not asking you to believe me," she said softly. "I'm asking you to watch him. Just watch." Valerian did watch, and what he saw unraveled him in ways no military defeat ever had. He began attending council sessions with new eyes, cataloging details he had dismissed as irrelevant. Marcellus arrived early and left late, always ensuring private moments with other council members. His recommendations consistently pulled troops away from the capital, thinning the palace guard under the guise of reinforcing distant borders. When Valerian quietly reviewed requisition records, something he delegated but rarely examined personally, he found discrepancies. Weapons shipments that never arrived at their designated outposts, gold transferred to eastern accounts that seemed to vanish into administrative fog. Individually, each instance could be explained away as bureaucratic error. Together, they formed a pattern, and the pattern pointed to a slow, methodical consolidation of power that had been happening right under his nose for months, perhaps years. The realization was a specific kind of agony, not the sharp pain of sudden betrayal, but the deep, grinding ache of discovering that trust itself had been weaponized against him. Valerian had survived assassination attempts, rebellions, political coups, all delivered by enemies he could see and name. But this was different. Marcellus wasn't an enemy. He was family in every way that mattered. They had shared battlefields and wine, losses and victories. Valerian had stood as witness at Marcellus's wedding, had mourned beside him when fever took his wife and infant son in a single winter, had believed, with absolute certainty, that if anyone in the Empire could be counted on, it was him. And now he had to accept that either Maelis was catastrophically wrong, which seemed increasingly unlikely, or the man he trusted most was preparing to destroy him. Both options felt like drowning. He couldn't confront Marcellus directly. Not yet. Not without irrefutable proof that would force the council to act. Accusing a beloved general of treason based on suspicious troop movements and accounting irregularities would fracture the already fragile loyalty holding the empire together. Half the council would side with Marcellus out of genuine belief in his innocence. The other half would exploit the conflict for their own advantage. Civil war would follow. Thousands would die. And if Valerian was wrong, if he had let the words of a servant poison him against a loyal friend, then the guilt would be unlivable. So instead, he did something far more dangerous. He set a trap. He drafted a false report about a planned expansion into the northern territories, complete with troop deployments, supply chains, and strategic timelines. Then he shared it only with Marcellus, claiming he wanted the general's private assessment before presenting it to the full council. If Marcellus was loyal, the report would remain confidential. If he was a traitor, he would need to share the intelligence with whatever network he had built, because a major military campaign would disrupt his plans. Valerian waited. 3 days later, his network of informants, people Marcellus didn't even know existed, reported that coded messages had been sent from the palace to 3 separate locations in the eastern provinces. The messages contained details from the northern expansion report, details only Marcellus possessed. Valerian sat alone in his study that night, staring at the intercepted correspondence, and felt something inside him crack. He had been right to watch. Maelis had been right to warn him, and being right felt like being gutted. He thought about the years of friendship, the battles fought side by side, the trust he had given freely because it seemed impossible that Marcellus could ever harm him. He thought about his brother, executed for treason, about how betrayal seemed to be the only constant in his life. And then he thought about Maelis, about the fact that she had risked everything to warn him, that she had seen danger he was blind to, not because she was smarter or more strategic, but because she paid attention in a way no one else did. Because she cared about him, not the emperor, not the figurehead, but him. The man beneath the crown. And that caring had saved his life. He summoned her to the study just past midnight. She arrived breathless, her hair hastily pinned, concern sharp in her eyes. Is something wrong? He looked at her for a long moment, this young woman with no title, no power, no protection, who had somehow become the only person in the entire empire he could trust completely. You were right, he said quietly. About Marcellus, about everything. Her expression shifted from worry to something that looked like relief mixed with sorrow. What will you do? Valerian exhaled slowly. What I always do. What the Empire requires. He paused. But first, I need you to understand something. You saved my life, Maelis, and I will not forget that. Ever. The arrest happened at dawn, executed with the kind of precision that left no room for resistance. Valerian deployed forces Marcellus didn't know he controlled. Elite units loyal to the throne rather than individual commanders, soldiers who had been watching the general for weeks. They surrounded his residence while he slept, seized correspondence that detailed the full scope of the conspiracy, and brought him to the palace in chains before the rest of the council even knew what was happening. By the time the sun fully rose, Marcellus was kneeling in the great hall flanked by guards, his face a mask of shock and fury. The evidence was laid out on the table like corpses at an autopsy. Letters, financial records, testimony from officers he had tried to turn. It was comprehensive, damning, irrefutable. And Valerian delivered it all in a voice devoid of emotion, as if reading weather reports. The council sat in stunned silence as Valerian recounted the full extent of the betrayal. Marcellus had been building a parallel command structure for over 2 years, siphoning resources, positioning loyalists, preparing to seize control the moment the empire faced any significant crisis. He had been waiting for the right moment, a failed harvest, a border incursion, an economic collapse, anything that would justify a military coup disguised as stabilization. The plan was elegant in its patience. Marcellus would have stepped in as protector, claimed he was saving the empire from Valerian's increasingly erratic decisions, consolidated power, and ruled through the council as a figurehead emperor answerable to military authority. It would have worked, if not for a servant girl who paid attention when no one else did. Marcellus's eyes found Maelis, standing in her usual position near the wall. The hatred in his gaze was nuclear. Valerian saw it, saw the exact moment Marcellus understood who had unraveled him. And in that instant, Valerian made a decision that would haunt him. He could not show favoritism, could not reveal that Maelis mattered to him, because the moment he did, she would become a target for every enemy he had, and he had thousands. So when Marcellus spat, brought down by a whore's whispers, Valerian didn't defend her, didn't correct him, didn't even look at her. He simply continued outlining the charges in that same flat imperial tone, as if she didn't exist, as if her courage meant nothing, as if she were still invisible. It was strategic. It was necessary. It was the only way to keep her alive in a palace that would tear apart anyone he showed weakness for. But Maelis, standing against the wall with her hands clasped and her expression carefully blank, felt the cut as deeply as any blade. The trial lasted 3 hours. Marcellus was given the opportunity to defend himself, to explain the evidence, to offer any context that might mitigate his actions. He said nothing. Just stared at Valerian with the kind of contempt reserved for profound disappointment, as if Valerian had failed him, rather than the other way around. When the final verdict was read, execution by beheading to be carried out at sunset, Marcellus finally spoke. "You've become exactly what you feared," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "A tyrant who trusts no one, who sees betrayal in every shadow because he's incapable of love. Your father would be ashamed." Valerian's expression didn't flicker. "My father is dead, and you will join him." The guards dragged Marcellus away. The council dispersed in uncomfortable silence, and Valerian sat alone at the head of the table, staring at nothing, while Maelis quietly gathered the scattered documents with hands that trembled. She wanted to go to him. Wanted to say that he had done the right thing, that Marcellus's words were poison meant to wound, that protecting the empire sometimes required impossible choices. But when she approached to collect the final stack of parchment, Valerian spoke without looking at her. "Leave." Just one word. Cold, dismissive, the voice of an emperor addressing a servant who had outlived her usefulness. Maelis froze. She understood tactically why he couldn't acknowledge her in front of the council. But they were alone now. The hall was empty. And still he wouldn't look at her. Still he spoke to her as if she were nothing. She set down the documents carefully, her throat tight. "Yes, Your Majesty." She turned and walked toward the door, each step feeling like a small death. Behind her, Valerian's hands curled into fists against the table, his jaw so tight it ached. He wanted to call her back, wanted to explain, But the words lodged in his chest like shrapnel, sharp and unmovable. So he said nothing. And Maelis left. And the space between them, which had been shrinking for months, suddenly became a chasm. Marcellus was executed at sunset in the central square, before a crowd of thousands. Valerian watched from the palace balcony, his face an expressionless mask, his hands gripping the stone railing hard enough to leave marks. The executioner's blade fell clean. The general's head rolled across the platform. The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and shocked silence. It was done. The threat was eliminated. The empire was secure. And Valerian felt nothing except a vast, echoing emptiness that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. He returned to his chambers that evening, expecting Maelis to be there, preparing his study as she always did, her presence a quiet constant that made the day's brutality bearable. But the room was dark. The lamps were unlit. The fire was cold. She hadn't come. For the first time in 6 years, she had not come. He told himself it meant nothing. She was probably reassigned temporarily, or delayed by palace logistics, or simply exhausted from the day's events. But when the next morning came and a different servant entered to prepare the hall, a nervous young man who spilled water and couldn't meet Valerian's eyes, the emperor felt something close to panic claw at his chest. "Where is Maelis?" he demanded. The boy stammered. I don't know, Your Majesty. I was told to take over her duties until further notice." Valerian dismissed him with a sharp gesture and immediately summoned the head housekeeper. Thessa arrived with the wary expression of someone who had served long enough to recognize danger in an emperor's tone. "Maelis Rowan," Valerian said without preamble. "Where is she?" Thessa's eyes flickered with something that might have been pity. "She requested reassignment, Your Majesty. Yesterday evening. I granted it." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Reassignment?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "To where?" Thessa hesitated, then spoke with the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news to a predator. "To the southern wing. Laundry services. She said she preferred work that didn't require proximity to the imperial chambers." The implication was clear. Maelis had removed herself. Deliberately. Permanently. She had chosen invisibility again, chosen safety, chosen distance from him. And Valerian understood with devastating clarity that this was his fault. He had protected her the only way he knew how, by pretending she didn't matter, by refusing to defend her, by treating her exactly as Marcellus had named her, as nothing. And she had internalized the lesson, had understood that proximity to the emperor was not protection, but exposure, that mattering to him was not safety, but risk. And she had done the only rational thing. She had left. For 3 days, Valerian tried to function normally. He attended council sessions, reviewed reports, made decisions that affected millions of lives. But everything felt wrong. The great hall was too cold without her adjusting the fire. The wine tasted sour because the new servant poured it at the wrong temperature. The rhythm of his mornings was shattered. He found himself waiting for her footsteps, for the particular way she moved through space, economical, quiet, somehow soothing just by existing. And when the wrong person entered instead, he felt rage simmer just beneath his skin. Not at the replacement servants, who were doing their best, but at himself. For failing to understand that some things, once broken, cannot be commanded back into wholeness. That you cannot treat someone as disposable and expect them to remain. That power, for all its reach, cannot undo the damage of silence. On the 4th day, he went looking for her. Not through official channels, not by summoning her like property to be retrieved. He went himself, down corridors he had never walked, into the parts of the palace where emperors did not belong. The southern wing smelled of lye and steam, its halls narrow and poorly lit. He found the laundry rooms by following the sound of water and women's voices. When he appeared in the doorway, the emperor, in full imperial regalia, standing in a servant's workspace, every conversation stopped. 20 women froze mid-task, their faces pale with shock. And there, in the corner, bent over a washing basin with her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back, was Maelis. She looked up. Their eyes met. And for a moment, Valerian saw something in her expression that made his chest constrict. Not fear. Not even anger. Just a deep, resigned sadness that told him he was too late, that whatever had existed between them, he had already killed it. Maelis set down the garment she had been scrubbing, dried her hands on her apron, and approached him with the mechanical deference of a servant addressing her sovereign. Not the quiet familiarity they had built over months, not the warmth, just protocol. She stopped the appropriate distance away, lowered her eyes, and waited. The other women watched in absolute silence, their shock palpable. Valerian wanted to speak, but every word he had prepared died in his throat. Because what could he possibly say? That he missed her? That the palace felt empty without her? That he had made a mistake treating her like she didn't matter when she was the only thing that did? All of it sounded absurd when spoken by an emperor to a laundry servant in front of witnesses. So instead, he said the only thing that felt safe. I need to speak with you, privately. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and Maelis heard it that way. She led him to a small storage room off the main corridor, closed the door, and stood with her back to the shelves of linens, her posture perfect, her expression carefully blank. Valerian had faced down warlords and assassins with less trepidation than he felt standing in this tiny room, watching her refuse to meet his eyes. "Why did you leave?" he asked quietly. Maelis's jaw tightened. "I requested reassignment, Your Majesty. It's within my rights as palace staff." Her voice was polite, empty, the voice she had used 6 years ago when she was truly invisible. "That's not what I asked." Silence. Then, finally, Maelis looked up, and the pain in her eyes was so raw it nearly staggered him. "What did you expect me to do?" Her voice cracked slightly. "Stay and pretend that what happened in the Great Hall was normal? That being called a whore while you said nothing was just part of the arrangement?" Valerian flinched. "I couldn't defend you in front of the council. If I had shown that you mattered to me, you would have become a target. Every enemy I have would have used you against me." Maelis laughed bitterly. "So instead you used me first. You let Marcellus name me as something vile and you said nothing. You looked at me like I was furniture. Like I was exactly what he accused me of being." Her hands were shaking now, her composure fracturing. "Do you have any idea what that felt like? I warned you because I thought you saw me as more than just—" She stopped herself, swallowing hard. "It doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong. And I won't make that mistake again." The words hit him like a sentence. Final. Irrevocable. Valerian stepped closer, his voice desperate in a way he hadn't allowed himself to sound in 20 years. "You weren't wrong, Maelis. You matter to me more than anyone in this entire empire. I was trying to protect you." She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks now unchecked. "You protected yourself, Your Majesty. You protected your reputation, your authority, your precious control. But you didn't protect me. Because protecting me would have required admitting that a servant could matter, that someone like me could be worth defending. And that terrified you." The accuracy of her words was devastating. Valerian wanted to argue, to explain the impossible calculus of ruling, the sacrifices required, the way personal desires had to be subordinated to imperial necessity. But looking at her now, this woman who had saved his life, who had seen him as human when everyone else saw only power, he realized she was absolutely right. He had chosen safety over honesty, control over connection, and in doing so, he had destroyed the one relationship that made his life bearable. "What do you want me to do?" The question came out broken, stripped of authority. "Tell me how to fix this." Maelis wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her expression hardening into something that looked like self-preservation. "There is no fixing this, Your Majesty, because even if you meant everything you're saying right now, even if you actually care, it changes nothing. I'm still a servant. You're still the emperor. And the world doesn't allow people like me to matter to people like you. Not in any way that doesn't end in my destruction." She straightened her shoulders, visibly gathering the pieces of herself back together. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to have served you, truly. But I need to go back to being invisible now. It's safer that way, for both of us." She moved toward the door. Valerian caught her wrist, gently, desperately. "Maelis, please." She stopped but didn't turn. "Let me go, Your Majesty." Her voice was steady now, resolved. "Please, just let me go." And because he was finally learning what it meant to put her needs above his own, Valerian released her wrist and stepped back. Maelis opened the door and walked away, and Valerian stood alone in the storage room, surrounded by linens that smelled of lavender and loss, understanding for the first time what it meant to have absolute power over everything except the one thing that mattered. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in functional suffering. Valerian governed with the same efficiency he always had. He restructured the military command to prevent another Marcellus-style consolidation of power. He implemented the northern expansion he had used as bait, turning a false report into actual strategy. He resolved trade disputes, appointed new council members, negotiated treaties. The empire ran smoothly. Observers noted that the emperor seemed sharper, more focused, unburdened by the betrayal that might have broken a lesser ruler. What they didn't see were the nights he spent staring at documents without reading them, the mornings he woke reaching for a connection that no longer existed, the way his hand still moved toward the goblet 3 seconds after it was placed, muscle memory from routines that had been shattered. He was an empire of one, and the loneliness was suffocating. Maelis, meanwhile, disappeared into the machinery of palace service with the determination of someone trying to erase herself. She worked double shifts in the laundry, volunteered for the worst tasks, kept her head down and her mouth shut. The other servants gave her a wide berth, unsure whether to treat her with sympathy or suspicion. Rumors circulated. Some said she had been the emperor's secret lover and fallen from grace. Others claimed she had been a spy for Marcellus and barely escaped execution. A few whispered she had used witchcraft to seduce Valerian and was now paying the price. None of it was true. But Maelis let the stories swirl around her like smoke, finding a strange comfort in being misunderstood. At least misunderstanding kept people at a distance. At least it meant no one asked questions that would require her to admit the truth, that she had fallen in love with a man she could never have, and leaving him had felt like amputating part of her soul. She tried not to think about him, tried not to wonder if he was sleeping, if he was eating, if the new servants were managing to read his moods the way she had. She told herself it didn't matter, that he was the emperor, and would survive without her the way he had survived rebellions and assassinations and betrayals far worse than her absence. But late at night, when the laundry rooms were empty and the palace was quiet, she would remember small things. The way his shoulders relaxed when she entered a room, the rare, almost invisible smile when she said something that surprised him, the vulnerability in his voice when he asked her opinion, as if her thoughts were treasures he was privileged to receive. And she would press her palms against her eyes and breathe through the ache until it became manageable again. This was the right choice. The only choice. She had to believe that, or the pain would consume her entirely. What neither of them knew was that their separation had not gone unnoticed by the council. Several members, particularly those who had been closest to Marcellus, were watching Valerian carefully for signs of weakness. They had seen the emperor's uncharacteristic tension since the execution, the way his decisions had become more rigid, his tolerance for dissent even thinner than usual. They sensed instability beneath the iron control. And instability, to ambitious men, was opportunity. Lord Castor, a trade magnate with aspirations toward more direct power, began quietly testing boundaries, proposing policies that directly contradicted Valerian's known preferences, speaking out of turn during sessions, building alliances with other council members who felt the emperor had become too autocratic. It was subtle, strategic, the kind of slow-moving coup that learned from Marcellus's mistakes. And Valerian, distracted by grief he couldn't name and loss he couldn't acknowledge, didn't see it forming. Thessa, the head housekeeper, saw it, though. She had survived 40 years in the palace by being invisible and observant in equal measure, and she recognized the signs of a power structure beginning to crack. She also recognized that Maelis's absence had created a vacuum that was affecting the emperor in ways he probably didn't understand himself. So one evening, after the laundry shifts had ended and Maelis was alone folding linens by candlelight, Thessa appeared in the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression severe. "You're a fool," she said without preamble. Maelis looked up, startled. "Excuse me?" Thessa stepped into the room. "I told you to stay away from him. I warned you what would happen." But now that you've gone and made yourself matter to the most powerful man in the Empire, you don't get to just run away and pretend it never happened. Maelis's hand stilled on the fabric. I don't know what you're talking about. Thessa's laugh was harsh. Don't insult my intelligence, girl. The Emperor is falling apart. And when emperors fall apart, empires follow. Whatever happened between you two, fix it, before we all pay the price. Maelis stared at Thessa, her heart hammering against her ribs. He's not falling apart. The Empire is functioning perfectly. I've heard the report same as everyone. Thessa shook her head slowly, her weathered face tired. The machinery is working, yes, but the man operating it is barely holding on. I've watched emperors for 4 decades, child. I know the difference between strength and the performance of strength. Valerian is performing, brilliantly, but it's costing him something vital. And when that runs out, when he finally breaks under the weight of isolation he's built around himself, the jackals on the council will tear him apart. She paused, her voice softening slightly. You're the only person I've ever seen him trust. The only one he let close enough to matter. Whether you meant to or not, you became his anchor. And now he's adrift. The words settled over Maelis like a heavy cloak, suffocating and impossible to remove. She wanted to argue that Thessa was wrong, that she was just a servant, that emperors didn't need anchors. They needed armies and advisors and political alliances. But she remembered the way Valerian's expression had shifted when she entered a room, the way he spoke to her as if her thoughts held weight, the way he had looked at her in that storage room with something that resembled desperate hope. And she understood, with sick certainty, that Thessa was right. She had mattered to him. Maybe still did. And her absence wasn't protecting either of them. It was creating a wound that was bleeding both of them dry. What am I supposed to do? Maelis whispered. Go back and pretend everything is fine? He chose power over me, Thessa. He let Marcellus call me vile things and said nothing. How am I supposed to trust him after that? Thessa moved closer, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. He made a mistake. A strategic one, yes, but still a mistake born from fear. Fear of losing you to his enemies. Fear of making you vulnerable by showing he cared. She reached out and gripped Maelis's shoulder. I'm not saying you have to forgive him. I'm not saying you owe him anything. But I am saying that if you walk away completely, if you let pride and hurt make this decision for you, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. And so will he. The older woman's eyes held a depth of understanding that spoke of her own buried regrets. Love doesn't ask permission before it ruins you, child. It just does. The only choice you get is whether you face that ruin alone or together. She released Maelis's shoulder and turned toward the door. Think about it, but think fast, because the council is circling, and he's too distracted to see the knives being sharpened. That night, Maelis couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, Thessa's words echoing through her mind in an endless loop. Love. The woman had named it love, and Maelis couldn't even pretend to be surprised, because of course it was love. What else could explain the way her chest ached when she thought about Valerian sitting alone in his study? What else could explain the fact that even now, even after everything, she still worried about him? Still wanted to know if he was all right? Still felt this pull toward him that defied every rational thought she possessed? She had fallen in love with the Emperor, with the loneliest, most unreachable man in the world. And the cruelty of it was that he might love her back, in whatever broken, incomplete way a man like him was capable of loving. But love wasn't enough. Love didn't change the fundamental reality that she was powerless, and he was power incarnate. Except Thessa was right about one thing. Maelis did have power, not the kind that commanded armies or shaped laws, but the subtler, more dangerous kind. The power to be seen. The power to anchor someone who desperately needed anchoring. The power to remind a man drowning in authority that he was still human. And if she walked away from that, if she let fear and hurt make her abandon him, then she would be doing exactly what everyone else in his life had done. Using him, taking from him, leaving when it became difficult. She would be proving that he was right to trust no one, right to barricade himself behind walls of power and control, right to believe that connection was weakness and isolation was strength. And Maelis realized, with a clarity that felt like waking from a long sleep, that she couldn't do that to him, couldn't be one more person who confirmed his worst beliefs about human nature. Even if it cost her everything, even if it destroyed her, she had to try. The next morning, Maelis walked through the palace corridors toward the imperial wing with her heart in her throat and her hands clenched so tightly her nails left crescents in her palms. She had no plan beyond showing up, no speech prepared, no guarantee that Valerian would even allow her near him after she had requested reassignment and made it clear she wanted distance. But she kept walking anyway, past startled servants who recognized her, past guards who looked uncertain whether to stop her, past all the voices in her head screaming that this was foolish and dangerous and destined to end in humiliation. She reached the great hall just as dawnlight was beginning to filter through the eastern windows. The door was closed. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What if he turned her away? What if his silence in the hall had been genuine dismissal rather than strategic protection? What if she was wrong about everything? Before she could spiral further into doubt, the door opened. Valerian stood there, dressed but disheveled in a way she had never seen, his shirt untucked slightly, his hair not quite in order, shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He stared at her as if she were a ghost, or a hallucination born from exhaustion and longing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Valerian's voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. Maelis. Just her name. But the way he said it, like a prayer, like a confession, like something he had been holding in his chest for weeks and finally released, made her knees weak. She forced herself to meet his eyes. May I come in, Your Majesty? He stepped back immediately, pulling the door wider, and she entered the hall that had once felt like a second home and now felt like foreign territory. The room was exactly as she remembered, and completely different, because she was different. He was different. Everything had fractured and reformed into something new. Valerian closed the door and stood with his back to it, as if afraid she might flee if he didn't block the exit. Why are you here? He asked. Not accusatory, just genuinely confused, as if her presence defied all logic. Maelis took a slow breath. Because Thessa told me you're falling apart, and because I couldn't stand the thought of you facing whatever's coming alone. His expression shifted. Surprise, followed by something that looked like pain. I'm not your responsibility, Maelis. You don't owe me anything, especially not after... He stopped himself, his jaw tightening. After what I failed to do in front of the council. She nodded. You're right. I don't owe you anything, but I'm not here out of obligation. She stepped closer, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. I'm here because despite everything, despite the hurt and the anger and the impossibility of this, I care about you. And I think you care about me. And maybe that's foolish. Maybe it's dangerous. But it's also the truth. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if the ground would hold or give way entirely. Valerian stared at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed down to her bones. Then he crossed the space between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of weeks of restraint finally breaking. He didn't kiss her, didn't speak, just held her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand beneath his feet. Maelis felt his heartbeat against her cheek, rapid and unsteady, felt the way his hands trembled slightly where they pressed against her back. And she realized that Thessa had understated things. He wasn't falling apart. He had already fallen. He was just better at hiding the pieces than most people. She wrapped her arms around him and held on, offering the only thing she had to give. Presence. Witness. The assurance that he was not, in this moment, alone. When Valerian finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears he refused to shed. I should have defended you, he said, his voice raw. In the hall, in front of everyone. I should have made it clear that you were not what Marcellus accused you of being. That you mattered. That you... He stopped, struggling with words that had lived inside him for too long without release. I was afraid. Not of the council, not of my enemies, but of what would happen if I admitted that you had become the most important person in my life. Because everyone I've ever loved has either betrayed me or been taken from me. And I thought if I kept you at a distance, if I pretended you were just another servant, I could protect you from that pattern. But all I did was hurt you, and lose you anyway. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch reverent. I'm sorry, Maelis. I'm so sorry. And if you can't forgive me, I understand. But please, please don't leave again. I can survive losing almost anything, but not you. Not again. Maelis felt tears slip down her cheeks, hot and unbidden. She had imagined this conversation 100 different ways during the sleepless nights in the laundry quarters, had rehearsed speeches about boundaries and self-preservation, about why caring for him wasn't enough to bridge the impossible distance between their worlds. But standing here now, with his hands cradling her face like she was something precious and breakable, all those careful arguments dissolved into nothing, because the truth was simpler and more devastating than any logic she could construct. She loved him, not the emperor, not the legend, but the exhausted, lonely, deeply wounded man beneath the crown who had learned to survive by never letting anyone close enough to matter. And he loved her back, imperfectly, fearfully, but genuinely. And that changed everything, even if it changed nothing about the world they lived in. I forgive you, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. But Valerian? She used his name deliberately, claiming the intimacy it represented. We can't pretend this is simple. I'm still a servant. You're still the emperor. And the moment anyone realizes what you feel for me, I become a weapon they can use against you. She saw him flinch at the truth of it, saw the strategic part of his mind already calculating threats and countermeasures. So what do we do? He asked quietly. Pretend this doesn't exist? Go back to the way things were before? Maelis shook her head. We can't go back, but maybe we can go forward differently, carefully. She searched his eyes. I'll return to my duties in your chambers. But in public, we maintain protocol. No favoritism, no visible connection. I remain invisible to everyone except you. And in private, in moments like this, we can be honest. We can be real. It's not perfect, but it might be enough. It might keep us both alive. Valerian's hands slid from her face to her shoulders, his grip firm but gentle. That's not fair to you, to exist in the margins of my life, to hide what you mean to me as if it's something shameful. His voice carried an edge of self-loathing. You deserve more than secrecy and shadows. Maelis smiled sadly. Maybe. But I'd rather have you in shadows than not have you at all. And you need someone who sees you, Valerian. Someone who reminds you that power isn't the same as worth. That you're more than the empire you built. She paused, her voice dropping. Let me be that person, even if no one else knows. Even if history never records my name next to yours. Let me matter to you in the only way the world will allow. The words hung between them, an offering and a surrender wrapped into one. Valerian pulled her close again, his face buried in her hair, and she felt him nod against her temple. Agreement, acceptance, a pact sealed in silence and necessity. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other while the sun rose fully and painted the great hall in shades of gold and amber. Eventually, practical reality intruded. Valerian had a council session in 2 hours. Maelis needed to formally request her transfer back to the imperial wing. There were logistics to manage, appearances to maintain, a world that would not pause simply because 2 people had found each other in the wreckage of their respective isolations. But for now, for this stolen moment, they allowed themselves to simply exist together. No titles, no roles. Just 2 people who had been alone for too long and had somehow, against all odds, found something worth protecting. When they finally separated, Valerian caught her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips. Thank you, he said quietly, for coming back, for not giving up on me. Maelis squeezed his fingers once before letting go. Thank you for being worth it. She left the great hall with her heart lighter than it had been in weeks, but her mind sharp with awareness of the danger they had just chosen. Because Thessa was right. The council was circling. And while Maelis and Valerian had repaired the fracture between them, they had also created a vulnerability that his enemies would exploit the moment they discovered it. She would need to be more careful than ever, more invisible, more strategic. She couldn't afford mistakes, couldn't let her feelings show on her face or in her movements, couldn't give anyone reason to look too closely at the servant girl who prepared the Emperor's chambers. As she walked back toward the servants' wing to collect her belongings and arrange her reassignment, she felt the weight of what she had committed to settle over her shoulders. This wasn't a fairy tale. There would be no public declaration of love, no marriage that elevated her station, no happy ending where the Emperor abandoned protocol to be with the woman he loved. That wasn't how the world worked. But there would be mornings together, quiet conversations, moments of genuine connection in a life otherwise dominated by performance and isolation. And for now, that would have to be enough. Maelis returned to her duties in the Imperial wing the following morning, and to outside observers, nothing had changed. She moved through the Great Hall with the same quiet efficiency, prepared his chambers with the same meticulous care, maintained the same professional distance in front of others. But in the small, unguarded moments, when she adjusted the lamp and their fingers brushed briefly, when she poured his water and he murmured a quiet thank you that carried worlds of meaning, when their eyes met across the room and something warm and vital passed between them, they built a language that belonged only to them. It was a language of small gestures and careful silences, of trust communicated through presence rather than words. And it sustained them both in ways that grand declarations never could have. Valerian began sleeping again. Eating. The tension that had carved lines into his face began to ease, replaced by something that almost resembled peace. But peace in the imperial court was always temporary. Lord Castor's coalition had been growing steadily, fed by whispered concerns about the Emperor's stability and rumors that Valerian had become paranoid after Marcellus's betrayal. The narrative they constructed was elegant in its simplicity. The Emperor could no longer be trusted to lead rationally. He saw conspiracies where none existed. He had executed a loyal general based on fabricated evidence. He was becoming his father, a man who had died alone and despised, having alienated everyone who ever cared for him through suspicion and cruelty. It was a lie built on a kernel of truth, and it spread through the council chambers like poison through water. 6 members now openly supported Castor's proposals over Valerian's directives. 4 more were wavering. If the coalition reached majority, they could legally force Valerian to abdicate or face a vote of no confidence that would strip his authority and reduce him to a figurehead emperor controlled by council decree. Maelis heard the whispers through the palace staff network. Servants always knew what was happening before the people in power realized they had lost control of the narrative. She brought her concerns to Valerian one evening as he worked late in his study, surrounded by documents and strategic maps. Lord Castor is planning something, she said quietly, setting down a tray of food he probably wouldn't eat. The servants are talking about unusual meetings, late-night gatherings in Castor's residence. Counselors who used to barely speak to each other are suddenly dining together weekly. Valerian looked up from his papers, his expression already shifting into the cold calculation that preceded strategic action. How many? Maelis didn't need clarification. 10, possibly 11 if Baron Thorne can be swayed. They're building toward a majority. Valerian's jaw tightened. He stood and moved to the window, staring out at the city lights that spread beneath the palace like scattered stars. They think I'm weak, that Marcellus's betrayal broke something in me. Maelis crossed the room to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched but not quite, maintaining the careful distance required even in private, because walls had ears and shadows had eyes. Are they wrong? She asked gently. Not a challenge. An invitation to honesty. Valerian was silent for a long moment. Marcellus did break something in me, he admitted quietly. The belief that loyalty could be earned through competence and fair treatment. The idea that if I just ruled well enough, served the empire faithfully enough, people would choose to stand beside me rather than against me. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw exhaustion that went bone deep. "But you put something back together. Something I didn't even know was missing until you were gone. The belief that I could be seen, truly seen, and not rejected. That someone could know all my failures and flaws and choose to stay anyway." His hand moved as if to reach for her, then stopped, falling back to his side. "So no, they're not entirely wrong. Something in me did break. But something else is being rebuilt. And I'm not sure which version of me is stronger." Before Maelis could respond, the study door burst open. A palace guard entered, breathing hard, his face pale with urgency. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. Lord Castor has called an emergency council session. He's invoking the emergency governance protocol, claiming a threat to imperial stability that requires immediate convening." Valerian's expression went absolutely cold. "On what grounds?" The guard swallowed. "He claims to have evidence of treasonous influence within the imperial household. He's demanding a formal investigation." His eyes flickered briefly to Maelis, then away. And in that moment, all three of them understood. Castor hadn't just been building a political coalition. He had been gathering information, watching, waiting for proof of the one vulnerability an emperor could never afford to show: attachment, affection, love. And somehow, despite all their caution, he had found it. The trap was sprung. And this time, Maelis wouldn't be saved by Valerian's silence. This time, her very existence had become the weapon pointed at his throat. The council chamber was already filled when Valerian entered, Maelis walking 3 paces behind him as protocol demanded, close enough to serve, far enough to appear insignificant. Every seat was occupied. Lord Castor stood at the far end of the table, his expression carefully composed into concern rather than triumph. But Maelis could see the predatory satisfaction in his eyes, the way he tracked her movement across the room like a hunter watching prey step into a snare. Valerian took his seat at the head of the table with the same cold composure he always carried into these sessions, but Maelis felt the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. He knew this was a coordinated strike, knew that whatever evidence Castor claimed to possess would be designed for maximum damage, and he was preparing to protect her the only way he knew how, by sacrificing whatever was necessary to keep her alive. Castor began without preamble, his voice measured and reasonable. "Your Majesty, fellow council members, I've called this emergency session because information has come to my attention that suggests a severe breach of imperial security and judgment." He produced a stack of documents, spreading them across the table. "Over the past 3 months, I've documented unusual patterns in the Emperor's behavior. Extended private meetings with a servant girl, preferential treatment in assignments, visible distraction during critical council sessions that coincide with her temporary reassignment to other duties." He paused, letting the implications settle. Individually, these might be dismissed as coincidence, but together, they suggest something far more dangerous: that our emperor has allowed personal attachment to compromise his judgment, that he has created a vulnerability our enemies could exploit, that he has, in essence, placed the entire empire at risk for the sake of a woman with no station, no protection, and no accountability. The council erupted in murmurs, some shocked, some calculating, all sensing blood in the water. Valerian remained motionless, his expression carved from ice. But Maelis saw his hands beneath the table, clenched into fists so tight his knuckles had gone white. Castor wasn't finished. "I propose a formal investigation into the nature of this relationship and the immediate removal of Maelis Rowan from imperial service pending the investigation's conclusion. Furthermore, I propose that the council assume temporary oversight of imperial household staffing to prevent similar breaches in the future." It was elegant. Castor wasn't directly accusing Valerian of anything criminal, just poor judgment, emotional weakness, the kind of human failing that would erode confidence without providing grounds for execution. And by demanding Maelis's removal, he was forcing Valerian into an impossible choice: defend her and confirm the attachment, or abandon her again to preserve his authority. Either way, Castor won. But Valerian had spent 23 years ruling an empire, and he had not survived this long by being predictable. He stood slowly, and the room fell silent. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Lord Castor, your concern for imperial security is noted. However, your proposal is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. He turned to address the full council, his gaze sweeping across each face with surgical precision. Maelis Rowan is not a security breach. She is the reason there was no successful coup after General Marcellus's betrayal. She identified the conspiracy when my own intelligence network missed it. She provided the warning that saved not just my life, but the stability of this empire. He paused, letting that truth land. You want to remove her for having access to me? She has access because she earned it through loyalty and competence that surpassed every trained advisor in this room. You want to investigate her influence? Investigate how a servant girl with no formal education managed to see threats that a council of supposedly brilliant strategists completely missed. The chamber went absolutely still. Valerian continued, his voice dropping to something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. Here's what will actually happen. There will be no investigation. There will be no removal. Maelis Rowan will remain in imperial service with my full confidence and protection. And if any member of this council, any member, attempts to harm her, intimidate her, or use her as leverage against me, I will consider it an act of treason and respond accordingly. He turned his full attention to Castor, and Maelis saw the Lord actually take a step back. You thought my attachment was weakness. You thought I would sacrifice her to preserve my image. But that's where you miscalculated, Castor. Because the emperor you're trying to manipulate died the day Marcellus was executed. The man standing before you now has learned something more valuable than strategy or power. Valerian's hand moved then, reached back without looking, and Maelis stepped forward to take it, her fingers intertwining with his in full view of the council. I've learned that the only thing worth protecting is what makes you human. Everything else is just performance. The council sat in stunned silence as Valerian and Maelis stood together, hands joined, the gesture simple but utterly revolutionary. This was an emperor declaring that love mattered more than politics, that connection was worth defending even at the cost of appearing weak, that he would rather be honest and vulnerable than powerful and alone. And in that moment, something shifted in the room, not immediately, not dramatically. But several council members exchanged glances. Baron Theron, Lady Civ, Commander Hayes, people who had been wavering toward Castor's coalition, but who now saw something unexpected. Strength. Not the brutal, solitary strength of absolute authority, but the harder, rarer strength of someone willing to risk everything for what they believed in. Castor, sensing his momentum collapsing, tried to rally. Your Majesty, this is exactly the kind of emotional decision-making I'm concerned about. Valerian cut him off with a gesture. This session is concluded. The proposal is denied. You're all dismissed. His tone left no room for argument. Except you, Lord Castor. You and I need to discuss your future on this council, privately. The other members filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact, uncertain whether they had just witnessed the Emperor's greatest mistake or his finest moment. When the chamber was empty except for Valerian, Maelis, and the increasingly pale Lord Castor, Valerian finally released Maelis's hand. She understood the dismissal and turned to leave, but he caught her wrist gently. Stay, he said quietly. I want a witness to this conversation. Someone I trust. Maelis nodded and positioned herself near the wall, her heart still racing from what had just happened. Valerian turned to Castor, his expression neutral but his eyes absolutely lethal. You tried to use her against me. That was your first mistake. Your second was assuming I would choose power over people I care about. I've made that mistake before, Castor. I'm not making it again. He moved closer, and despite being unarmed and outnumbered in terms of political alliances, Valerian radiated the kind of danger that made generals nervous. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to dissolve your coalition, you're going to publicly support my leadership, and you're going to pray that I decide your skills are valuable enough to overlook this attempted coup. Castor's face had gone from pale to gray. And if I refuse? Valerian smiled, and it was not a kind expression. Then I'll do what I should have done with Marcellus the moment I suspected betrayal. I'll act decisively, publicly, and without mercy. Your choice, Lord Castor. Loyal service or a very short walk to the executioner's platform. The threat hung in the air like smoke, Castor understood he had lost. Completely. Irrevocably. He had gambled that Valerian's attachment to Maelis was a weakness to exploit, but instead it had revealed an emperor who was done playing by the old rules of power politics. Done sacrificing personal truth for strategic advantage. Done being the lonely, isolated ruler his enemies expected. I will serve faithfully, Your Majesty, Castor managed, his voice barely steady. Valerian nodded once. See that you do. Dismissed. Castor fled. And when the door closed behind him, Valerian's shoulders finally dropped, the iron control giving way to something rawer. He turned to Maelis, and she saw exhaustion and relief and love warring across his features. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, feeling him sag slightly against her as if he had been holding himself together through pure will and could finally let go. You just risked everything, she whispered against his chest. For me. In front of everyone. Valerian's arms tightened around her. Not everything. I risked my reputation, my image as an untouchable emperor, but I gained something more valuable. He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. I gained the right to love you honestly, to not hide what you mean to me, to stop pretending that isolation is the same as strength. His hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture tender in a way that would have been impossible for him months ago. The council will adjust, or they won't. But either way, I'm done sacrificing the people who matter for the approval of people who don't. Maelis felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being chosen, of mattering, of being worth the risk. They stood together in the empty council chamber as evening light painted the walls in shades of amber and gold. Two people who had been invisible to each other for far too long, now finally, impossibly, seen. The empire would continue to turn. Threats would emerge and be handled. Politics would remain complicated and dangerous. But something fundamental had shifted. Valerian was no longer the great emperor who ruled alone from an unreachable height. He was a man who had learned that power without connection was just elaborate loneliness. That being vulnerable was harder and braver than being invincible. That the greatest mistake wasn't loving someone beneath his station. It was almost losing her because he had been too afraid to admit she mattered. And Maelis, who had spent her entire life believing her presence made no difference, now understood that she had changed the course of an empire simply by refusing to look away from a lonely man's humanity. That evening, when they finally left the council chamber and walked through the palace corridors together, not 3 paces apart but side by side, servants and guards watched with wide eyes but said nothing. The emperor and the woman who had been nothing in his empire but became everything. And history, in its quiet way, began rewriting itself to make room for a love story no one had seen coming. One built not on grand gestures or fairy tale magic, but on the simple, revolutionary act of seeing another person completely, and choosing, against all logic and consequence, to stay.